Welcome to these talks at the Metropolitan Museum on Sunday afternoon. And some, if not all of you, may wonder, what does the person who is responsible for Islamic art in this museum, what is he doing talking about Italian Renaissance art and even dwelling on a painting like this? Well, the answer is Italian Renaissance art represented Islam as it came to be crystallized in the minds of Christian Europeans for hundreds of years. And through our exploration of the symbolism of some of these wonderful paintings done in Renaissance Venice in the late 15th and early 16th century, we may actually discover together the identity of a central figure in one of the most mysterious paintings of the entire Renaissance, The Three Philosophers by Giorgione. But first, we go through the Metropolitan Museum's own treasures, and this strange painting by another Venetian artist of the period, Carpaccio, painted in 1510, already indicates the kind of extraordinarily subtle, symbolic, allegorical language that these painters used, and inviting us to crack the riddle of what they show, they invite us on an extraordinary journey of discovery. Here, Carpaccio invites us, with the two saints in the foreground, to meditate on the passion of Christ, the dead Christ on a broken throne, and you can see Job, the Old Testament prophet, on the right, and on the left, the Christian monk, abbot, Saint Anthony. They meditate on Christ, and we can already see that, the meditation takes us up to this symbol here, which is the cave in which Christ was buried and from which he was resurrected. And on this side is the world of death, and on this side, as the inscription in Hebrew on Job's seat here says, I know that my Redeemer liveth, so that on the right side you have a vision of paradise and eternal life. The soul is represented by these deer which are waylaid by the ferocious beasts of hell. But here the ferocious beast cannot capture the soul, which is a deer that has been entering into the land of salvation. You even have the contrast between the dead tree on the side of death and on the side of resurrection, the living tree. This kind of imagery actually is very prevalent in Islamic art of the 15th and 16th centuries too. But knowing now that this is how we can learn to read these paintings as wonderful sign languages, pictorial expression of religious symbolism, now we can discover and crack the meaning of this extraordinary painting about to come up. I'm talking about the Moor of Venice, the true Moor of Venice, this central, turbaned, Muslim-looking character in the middle of a painting by Giorgione, whom I believe we can now identify as the Spanish Muslim philosopher Ibn Rushd, Averroes, who died in 1198, and who was the single Muslim philosopher most read, most pondered by Christian Europeans, and most notably Venetians, in even as late as the 16th century. So here's our mysterious Moor of Venice. Here he appears in the painting. This painting, which has been called The Three Philosophers, ever since it was seen by a Venetian chronicler in 1525, hanging in a palace of a Venetian nobleman, Contarini. Then the painting traveled on and was sold in Northern Europe and entered the collections of the Archduke of Austria. You can actually see when he bought it in Brussels in 1649 that the painting is represented here. And when it entered Austrian collections it was identified as the three wise men, the three Magi. The Archduke himself thought he was buying a painting of three mathematicians, three astrologists, three astronomers. So who are these three characters? And the mystery has hung so thick upon this painting that in 1932, one of the Austrian curators, Wilde, took an X-ray of the picture and revealed, lo and behold, that the character on the right had rays coming up from the fold of his garment, which seemed to suggest that these three figures had to include Moses, because any Renaissance European looking at a bearded figure with rays looking like almost horns coming out from the top of his head must be Moses. And if the figure on the right is Moses, well then, maybe these three philosophers or three astronomers represent the three religions. And it's often been suggested that what we have were Moses, Mohammed, and a young Christian. Only in 2004, however, was the mystery of another Giorgione painting finally cracked by another Austrian specialist, Jürgen Rapp. And before we go into the mystery of the three philosophers, I want to invite you to look at what Jürgen Rapp figured out about this painting by Giorgione, which is in the Accademia in Venice, called The Tempest, painted in the very first years of the 16th century, and very famous as one of the very first European depictions of a stormy sky. And again, all sorts of interpretations have been offered. Indeed, ever since the middle of the 16th century, the key to Giorgione's meaning was lost, and Vasari, the great Italian Renaissance chronicler of the artists, even says that the trouble with Giorgione, whom he greatly admired for his craftsmanship, is his stories have no order. We simply cannot figure out what he's trying to say. Storie che non abbiano ordine. They do not have order. Well, Jürgen Rapp, looking at the 1525 chronicle of the paintings that hung in the Contarini Palace in Venice, was able to say, it was pointed out that aside from the three philosophers, the other paintings in the cycle of Giorgione works represent the legend of Troy. Therefore, this painting must have something to do with Troy. Why? Well, for one thing, Venetians were very proud of the idea that their ancestors were the mythical Veneti, who were supposed to have been a people led by a Trojan prince, a refugee from burning Troy, Prince Antenor. And if the Venetian people, therefore, have Trojan ancestors, then they are equal to the Romans, whose ancestors are also Trojans, led by Aeneas. And Venetian Renaissance statesmen were proud to claim this Trojan ancestry and were extremely interested in everything that could depict the Trojan cycle. So what Jürgen Rapp was able so brilliantly to show is that the character on the left is Prince Paris, shown in princely dress, but with the staff of a shepherd. Prince Paris has just seen the three goddesses who have offered him the choice of who is the most beautiful with the gift of the golden apple, and we know that Paris chose Aphrodite, and Aphrodite promised Paris that she would give him the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. And here is Prince Paris setting off to find her. Unfortunately, Prince Paris, up on Mount Ida, left behind his former lover, the nymph Oenone, whom he had got with child. And because he is abandoning her, and he's going back to Troy, and then off to seek his destiny and find Helen of Troy, Helen of Sparta, the wrath of the gods falls on the walls of Troy, a prefiguration of its destruction, out of which will rise a new race of Trojans who will found the great empires of Italy. So this was extremely ingenious, and let's see if this approach can help us decipher what Giorgione was trying to say in his painting of the three philosophers. Now, Vasari, the chronicler, already by the 1530s, 1540s, had trouble figuring out what Giorgione was trying to say. But Vasari, did admire Giorgione as the artist who introduced into Venice the style of sfumato, or smoky, foggy, misty effects invented, or in any case, associated with Leonardo da Vinci. Giorgione is very much a Mozart-type young figure who dies in his early 30s of the plague in 1510, leaves behind only a handful of masterpieces, but they are the masterpieces which introduce a new Venetian style, in contrast with the previous style we saw with Carpaccio, which is bright, sunlit, harsh, no atmospheric effects, everything is crystalline. Instead, Giorgione brings into Venetian painting fog, mist, shadow, and darkness. So here, the three philosophers, let's try to take one interpretation, which has been current since the 18th century, and which is still found very often repeated, that these are the three wise men, the three Magi. After all, weren't the three Magi astronomers too? Didn't they look for a star in the sky to guide them to the Christ child? We have, as recently as the 1980s, Ernst Gomrich, the well-known Austrian philosopher and historian of art, has suggested that two of the wise men here on the right are waiting for the results of the astronomical calculations of the younger man. Now, let's just see if that works out. Certainly we have three characters here, and these three characters are an aged man, a middle-aged man, and a young man, something we do very much associate with the convention of the three wise men. However, another theory advanced is that in the 16th and 17th century, Italian books often printed these triads which suggest the three ages of man, resemble the three wise men, but are not the three wise men. In this case, in essence, these three men are actually three famous astronomers who adorn the title page to Galileo's treatise printed in the early 17th century, Dialogus de Systemate Mundi, the dialogue of the system of the world, and the three men here are, on the right, Copernicus, looking young and beardless, on the far left, a very aged-looking Aristotle, and in the middle, the Greco-Egyptian astronomer of the 2nd century AD, Ptolemy, associated with the Ptolemaic system. So it's been suggested maybe the young man in the painting of Giorgione is Copernicus, who was actually studying in nearby Padova, the University of Venice, just when Giorgione was painting. And certainly at the close of the 15th century, the Venetian printing presses were showing these dialogues of great astronomers with, again, Ptolemy here on the left, and a recent German astronomer, Regiomontanus, discussing and pondering as if in eternal dialogue with Ptolemy regarding the system of the world. So Bruno Nardi, a modern Italian scholar, has suggested maybe the young man in the painting is the young Copernicus, and maybe the old man, the one in the painting, is Aristotle, and the turbaned man in the middle is this Greco-Egyptian cosmologist, Ptolemy. Well, perhaps, but when Ptolemy was actually represented in the Renaissance by the Venetians, he was always shown as a king, as here. Ptolemy, the astronomer, is deliberately confused by the 15th century artists with Ptolemy, king of Egypt, as if the great astronomer and cosmographer had been a king as well. So that even though he's an ancient Egyptian, 15th century Europeans tend to show Ptolemy dressed, garbed, and crowned as a contemporary European king. And that doesn't look like any one of the three characters of the Giorgione painting. Now, let's take the theory of the three wise men, and we have here one of the very oldest depictions of the Magi. It's from Ravenna, Byzantine style, early 6th century AD, and we already see at the beginning of the Middle Ages this stylization of those who had been Zoroastrian priests coming to worship the Christ child according to St. Matthew, stylized then as three wise men. Not that the Bible says that there were three of them, but because Matthew said that they brought gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh, tradition stylized them into representatives of pagan humanity coming to worship Christ, and necessarily three, so that the wise man bearing gold offers tribute to Jesus as King of Kings. Frankincense is offered by a second wise man in homage, in tribute to the God incarnate in man. And finally, the third wise man offers myrrh in recognition of the bitterness that will be undergone in suffering by Jesus Christ, the man. So since they're already stylized into three wise men, still in the 6th century AD mosaic from Ravenna, identified with contemporary Persians. They are dressed as what Magi really were supposed to be, Zoroastrian Persian priests. But they're also stylized to represent the three ages of man. And this becomes the norm in all these representations. You definitely see the elder, whose name was traditionally rendered as Melchior, the youngest, Caspar, and the middle-aged, with a brown beard or dark beard, Balthazar. And if we leap forward to 1,000 years later, another depiction of the three wise men, this time by Gentile da Fabriano in early 15th century Italy, we get this multiple effect, whereby I first invite you to see that, again, the three wise men always look at the Christ child, and none ever turns his head away from the Christ child. Indeed, that's another problem with the Giorgione painting, where we see that two gentlemen look in the same direction, but one turns away his head. Whereas in depictions of the Magi, what is important is that all three, here completely identified by Catholic Europeans of the 15th century as kings, look towards the Christ child. And the story of the Magi, could even be made to carry political associations, and our esteemed Iranian scholar colleague, Mr. Sudavar, has actually identified these three characters as idealized portraits of the Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund of Austria and Hungary, the Byzantine Emperor Manuel II, and the young Duke of Burgundy, heir to the Duchy of Burgundy, John, Duke of Nevers, John the Fearless, all three of whom were involved in a crusade against the Turks, ultimately to free Constantinople from their siege and finally liberate Jerusalem. So these stories show that contemporary history is seen as sacred, and 15th century Europeans are pulling sacred stories into significance for modern politics as well, as if these three contemporary European rulers were also going to be the three wise men who would save Europe from the Turks. As we come towards the end of the 15th century now, we have Andrea Mantegna's depiction of the three wise men, or the three kings, most interesting to us because Andrea Mantegna was a brother-in-law to the Gentile and Giovanni Bellini brothers in Venice, who were themselves the masters of Giorgione. So we're coming into the nexus of painters closely associated. And what we see here is that Mantegna depicts the incarnation as a mystical event taking place not in a manger, but in a cave. By now, Italian Renaissance artists and theologians are identifying the place where Christ is born with Plato's cave. That is, this dark, lower world of matter into which the divine, symbolized by the star, becomes incarnate for our salvation. And just as in the Carpaccio painting, Christ emerges from the dark cave that is this lower world to ascend in the resurrection, so in the mystery of the incarnation, he descends into the cave. The three wise men, again, all look very carefully at the Christ child, but we see that a further story is told. The oldest, Melchior, is an old European king, but the second one, Balthazar, with his clearly shaved head, dark beard, and turban doffed with respect in his hand, is a Muslim. And behind is the youngest Magus, Caspar, who from the 1480s on in European art begins to be depicted as an African. This is a moment which corresponds very closely with the conversion to Catholicism of the Kingdom of the Congo by Portuguese missionaries. The Congo Kingdom became the first great African ally of the Catholic Portuguese, and from the 1480s on, depictions of the three Magi multiply to signify not only the three ages of man, bearing three gifts that signify three natures in Christ, but also the three continents of humanity: Europe, Asia, i.e. Islam, and Africa, the new hope of Christianity. This Mantegna painting in the Getty collection in California emphasizes again what we have just said. The Magi, by the end of the 15th century, appear, one as an old European king, the second, the middle-aged man, as a Muslim, rendering tribute to the Christ child, while the third is the young African convert. And all three gaze intently at the Christ child. None must avert his gaze. Here, we get a further variation on the three Magi of great interest by a contemporary of Carpaccio and Giorgione in early 16th century Venice, Giovanni Manzueti. And in this case, what you will see is that the three Magi certainly depict the three races of man as conceived at the time, but all three now are shown as Muslims, and indeed they are wearing the very specific turbans of the Egyptian Sultanate, the Mamluk Sultanate, with which Venice had such close trading connections. The eldest Magus wears this complicated turban of a sultan, with what a European ambassador of the early 16th century said looked like snail's horns. as you can see here. Then you have the second and the third, who is shown as an African, and yet they are shown also as the Sultan, a provincial governor, and a high officer of the Egyptian Sultanate. And what this means is a reflection in paint of a prediction, a prophecy that was circulating in the Venetian lagoon in the beginning of the 16th century, at a time when, as the paintings don't really make us feel, things were going very badly for Venice. The Portuguese had gone around the Cape of Good Hope and seemed to be able to crack the Venetian trade monopoly with Egypt by tapping Indian spices at their source. Many European powers were leaguing against Venice to destroy her. The League of Cambrai in 1509, bringing together the Pope, who excommunicated Venice, the King of France, the Habsburg Emperor in Austria, all leagued against Venice, and as the French were saying at the time, tremblez, tremblez, bourgeois Venetiens, tremble, tremble, Venetian bourgeois, with the idea that the Venetians were corrupt, subtle traders, traitors to Christendom, always willing to sell out fellow Christians in order to trade with Muslims. And the Venetians were feeling particularly bad about this because the Turkish Muslims at the time were nibbling away Venetian territories in the Eastern Mediterranean. And it actually looked as though the Turks were going to win throughout the Mediterranean. And then Pietro Nanni, an aged monk, rose in one of the pulpits of Venice and preached to the people, saying, "I have heard. I have a prophecy. Yes, the Sultan of Islam will be triumphant. He will actually enter on horseback into the Vatican, into St. Peter's Church, and he will make his horse drink from the baptismal font in St. Peter's as from a watering trough. Yet at the very instant of his triumph, he will be struck by grace. The Sultan of Islam will become a Christian. And as ruler of the world, he will restore unto Venice all her possessions, all her influence in the East. He will even make Venice responsible in perpetuity for the administration of Jerusalem and Palestine." The conversion of the Sultan, the recognition by the Lord of Islam of the divinity of Christ, will bring about the glorious end of time and the eternal triumph of Venice. A message that was very consoling for the Venetians, of course, in their troubled early years of the 16th century. And that is what so many of these early 16th century Venetian paintings show, with the idea that the three wise men who come to worship Christ, in effect, represent the hoped-for conversion of the great Sultan of Islam, sometimes identified with the Sultan of Egypt, sometimes with the Sultan of Turkey, the two great powers of Islam that the Venetians normally dealt with. Now, when we come to Giorgione himself, we actually do have a painting which represents the three wise men explicitly. And what do we see? Well, we have actually two trilogies, and we can see that the two trilogies don't, again, necessarily correspond to the three wise men. I'll take the detail to show it more clearly. In the front, you have the three wise men, all again looking in the same direction at the Christ child, the elder, the middle-aged, the youth, all European in this case, but behind them you have a shadow trilogy, a second trilogy, as it were, a commentary upon the first. And the three sort of sub-wise men in the background represent two Muslims, a Turkish Muslim and a Tartar Muslim from the Black Sea area, who turn their head away from the Christ child, unlike the three holy Magi here. But the third and the youngest, the African, like a Congolese of the 1480s, 1490s, or first years of the 16th century, following the finger pointing of the Portuguese Christian knight, looks faithfully upon the Christ child. So Giorgione suggests that there are many meanings that we can read into these triads. Giorgione, again, explores the motif of the trilogy of worship with the adoration of the shepherds. And here now you do fully recognize the idea that Christ, seen here as the child in the star looks like a child, is incarnate in the cave, which is this lower world, identified with Plato's cave. And here, Giorgione plays with the idea of the three ages of man, in which you have the elder as Joseph, the middle-aged man, a shepherd, and a younger shepherd here. Again, the three ages of man, and all looking very intently upon the child. They are not the three wise men, but they remind us of them. They're a variation on the theme. Yet, in still another exploration of the triad of the three ages of man, we know that Giorgione painted this mysterious picture of three musicians, or the music lesson, which has absolutely never in Italian tradition of the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries ever been identified with the three wise men. Certainly you have the elder, the middle-aged, and the youth. The only traditional identification we've ever had was an attribution of the 17th century to another painter, and it was called the young Marcus Aurelius with his teachers. So the idea is you have the three ages of man, you have an evocation of the three wise men, but they are not necessarily the three wise men at all. So let's try to identify at least the two characters on the right, the elderly man and the man in the middle. And I think we can do it this way. The Muslim. Now, certainly in Venetian painting of the turn of the 15th and 16th centuries, you see Muslims pretty much everywhere. Here on the quay side, in this painting, this detail of a painting by Carpaccio called Witnessing a Miracle of a Relic of the True Cross. And up here, you have the two Muslim characters mingling in the crowd. Now, certainly we think of 15th and 16th century descriptions of Venice by writers of the time who remarked about how many foreigners could be seen in Venice. It's Shakespeare's famous remark, the trade and profit of the city consisteth of all nations. But the fact of the matter is, the Venetians had practically a monopoly of European trade with the Egyptian Sultanate, but they didn't allow many Muslims to come to Venice itself. There were indeed very few ambassadors allowed to set foot on Venetian land, which remained very strict about excluding most Muslims from the city. So what these Muslims are actually doing in these Venetian scenes is precisely what Carpaccio says they're doing. They are there as the symbols of non-Christian humanity to witness the miracle of the true cross, to witness the triumph of Christianity. The fact, however, that these are Venetian paintings means that for a Venetian audience, which included many merchants who went sometimes every year to Alexandria or Beirut, a Venetian audience demanded that Muslims look like Muslims. So that, as a result, the Muslims in Venetian paintings of the Renaissance look more like Muslims than any other Muslims to be seen in European art before the 19th century. And this is very clear in Carpaccio's painting for the cycle of Saint Stephen, representing young Saint Stephen in what looks like a stylized Jerusalem, preaching unto the non-Christians. And Carpaccio, who's used many sketchbooks from pilgrims or merchants to the Holy Land or to Egypt, has provided us with extremely faithful renditions of Ottoman Turks, Egyptian Muslims, like this one here, with this kind of horned turban, a North African Muslim with a fold of turban under the chin. We know that there was a great Venetian trade mission in Tlemcen in what is now Algeria. You have the Albanian Muslim here, and then here you have the Jew and the Orthodox Greek Christians there on the far left. All these represent non-Catholic humanity living in their infidelity, but about to hear the message of Christ. But they can also persecute it, as in this other painting by Carpaccio, which shows those Jews who chose to stone Stephen to death depicted as pretty much contemporary Muslims, recognizable as Muslims with the turbans. This other great cycle by Carpaccio makes it even clearer that we're talking about the fulfillment of the prophecy, the triumph of St. George, who has saved the maiden who was offered in sacrifice by a pagan king and queen on the seashore of Asia Minor. Now St. George is a Venetian knight, and the king and queen of Trebizond are shown as a Muslim sultan and his queen, and it's made very clear that as a result, St. George baptizes them. The Sultan has even laid down his turban, which is held by his page here, in a sign, along with his ministers, that Islam, the Lord of Islam, has recognized the triumph of Christ, that is the triumph of Venice. And the detail here makes that about as explicit as you could possibly wish. And that is why these Muslims have to look so real. Now, the triumph of Venice over Islam is an ambiguous theme, because everybody in Christian Europe knows that if there is one group of Christians who are narrowly dependent upon Muslim goodwill and enjoying excellent commercial relations with the Muslim powers, it is the Venetians. Venice would go bankrupt if it did not enjoy its monopoly of trade with Egypt. And Egypt would go bankrupt if it were not able to sell the goods from India coming up the Red Sea to the Venetian merchants. Actually, the trade ties between the Sultan of Egypt, proclaiming himself the protector of Islam, and the Doge of Venice, who proclaims himself a champion of Christendom, were so close that when the Portuguese, entering the Indian Ocean in the early 16th century, actually threatened both the Egyptians and the Venetians by taking away Indian trade from the Red Sea and Mediterranean route, the Venetians secretly allied themselves with the Egyptians to try to launch a fleet into the Indian Ocean to chase out the Christian Portuguese. And everybody in Europe knows this. And because Venice lies under such a cloud, the Venetians are going to proclaim their triumph through the symbolic story of St. Mark. St. Mark is the way Venice triumphs over Islam, not by fighting it directly, but by, as it were, tricking it, like good merchants. The merchants of Venice tell us that St. Mark the Apostle, whose symbol is the lion, the winged lion as depicted here by Carpaccio, that the Apostle St. Mark, after Christ's death, came to preach in Italy. And while he was at Aquileia, on the shore of what would become the Venetian lagoon, Christ appeared before him and said these mystical words, Pax tibi marce, evangelista meus. Peace upon thee, Mark, O my evangelist. Here in this lagoon will you find your final resting place. Then St. Mark, after the vision, went on, traveled to Egypt, preached in Alexandria, and suffered martyrdom in Alexandria, where he was buried. So how did he end up in Venice? even though here Carpaccio affirms that the Lion of St. Mark, as the protector of Venice, emphasizes that the Venetians, with their patron lion, dominate both on sea and on land. Well, according to Venetian legend, as here shown in a mosaic of the early 12th century from St. Mark's Basilica in Venice, and purporting to depict a miracle that occurred in the year AD 828, indeed, St. Mark was buried in Alexandria, and Alexandrian Christians recognized Mark as their patriarch and patron saint. So here is the city of Alexandria. But the Greek Christian monks and Coptic monks in Alexandria, now under Muslim rule, felt that the time had come to allow two Venetian merchants, Tribunus and Rusticus, to carry away the body of St. Mark, so miraculously preserved for nearly 800 years, to Venice, where it would be safe from the Muslims. Even though the Muslim rulers of Egypt were perfectly happy to have pilgrims from the Christian world come to Alexandria and pay taxes and dues in order to worship in the shrine of Mark in Alexandria. So the Muslim authorities were certainly reluctant to allow the Venetian merchants to take the body of St. Mark away. So what the Venetian merchants did, Tribunus and Rusticus, was carry away the body of St. Mark in a basket covered with pork chops. That way, the Egyptian customs inspectors at ship, when they were about to board their ship, wanted to look in the basket, saw the pork chops, said, oh, pork, take it away. And this is actually what it says in one of the world's earliest comic strips here in the Latin, Marcum furantur khanzir, hihi vociferantur. All that is Latin except for the Arabic khanzir, which means pork. Mark, they carry off. Pig, khanzir, these cry out. And below it says, carnibus absconsum volverunt fujumque retrorsum, hidden under meats, they go back and flee back, i.e. to Venice. So when Gentile Bellini, with his brother Giovanni Bellini, finishing the painting in 1506, 1507, depicted St. Mark preaching in Alexandria, they multiplied the symbols. St. Mark is shown in classical garb, but the Egyptians to whom he preaches are shown as contemporary Muslims, made as recognizably Muslim as possible for an early 16th century Venetian audience. Of course, it's the Venetians who believe in St. Mark, and so you can see them all ranged in their senatorial garb behind St. Mark. Now, in the background is a very strange-looking building, which actually suggests St. Mark's Basilica in Venice. Of course it does. It's supposed to. We're supposed to be in Africa at the same time. You can see palm trees. You can actually see a giraffe. So we are in Africa. The temple that would have been here in Alexandria when St. Mark preached would have been the temple of the Egyptian deity Serapis that Renaissance Italians were very interested in. Pico della Mirandola, Marsilio Ficino, all go into sort of deliriums of theological and philosophical exegesis in remarking how the ancient Egyptian cross of life looks like a prefiguration of the Christian cross, and the god Serapis actually held such a cross of life against his heart as a prefiguration of the apostolic message. And the Venetians make the idea of the transfer crystal clear when Gentile Bellini shows the procession of the relic of the true cross in St. Mark's Square. The same painter has made it absolutely clear that Venice, with the basilica it built to receive the body of Mark, is actually the new apostolic see of Mark. Venice is the new Alexandria. When the Pope dares excommunicate Venice, as he did in 1509, the Venetians reply, "You have been founded by Peter. We have been founded by just as good an apostle, even a better. He wrote a gospel, by Mark." Venice is the new Alexandria because Venice has never come under Muslim domination. We trade with the Muslims, but we trick them. That is the Venetian triumph. So when Giovanni Manzueti paints the story of St. Mark in the 1510s, 1520s, he multiplies depictions of the Basilica of Alexandria as a prefiguration of St. Mark's Basilica with various emblems showing that we are somehow in Muslim Egypt, and the Roman governor of Alexandria in the 1st century AD is shown as an Egyptian sultan. And you have Venetian merchants wandering through the Egyptian crowd. And those who put Mark to death, the pagans, are shown again as contemporary Muslim Egyptians in this painting by Giovanni Manzueti. Even as late as 1547, when Tintoretto paints another aspect of the story of St. Mark, we can see this transfer of symbolism. Here, Tintoretto paints the moment when the pagans, having killed Mark, intended to burn his body on a funeral pyre there at the end of the square. But a storm broke out and the rain drenched the funeral pyre. The pagans fled in terror, and the good Christians of Alexandria were able to save St. Mark. And it's a prefiguration of the future transfer of the body of Mark to Venice itself. The two stories are sort of telescoped. The elderly gentleman holding the rope of the camel, near the rope of the camel, is Tommaso Rangone, the patron of Tintoretto. Tintoretto actually painted himself right there in a self-portrait under the camel's neck. And if you go to Venice, you will actually see that if you stand right in front of St. Mark's Basilica and look at the little square in front of you, in 1547, this is what you would have seen. This is the Sansovino church that stood there. These are the Procurazie Nuove, and the idea is you yourselves are receiving Mark into you. You are here in Venice, and Mark comes to us, Mark comes into us, and we become the new and worthier Alexandria. The new apostolic see, we are the true city of the apostle. So now it doesn't become difficult at all to recognize what all these Muslims are doing in 16th century Venetian paintings. As the 16th century wears on, painters like Titian, and as here in 1519, show the style becoming ever fleshier and heavier and more realistic. But you still get the same idea when the Venetian nobleman of the Pesaro family and his brother in the church kneel and beg Peter for his intercession with the Virgin, almost represented like a dogaressa in front of her wonderful palace with fleshy cherubim up in the clouds. You will have a Muslim here on the far left. He is the Sultan of Islam who bows his head beneath the papal banner upheld by a Christian knight. Again, a symbol of the hoped-for conversion of the Sultan. Now, these representations of Muslims in Venetian art owe a great deal to Giorgione's own master, Gentile Bellini, who in 1479-1480 was appointed by the Venetian state to accompany a Venetian embassy to the Sultan of Turkey, to Istanbul. This was to negotiate a peace treaty, and the Venetians thought it would be a good idea to impress the Turks with a great artist who could show the Sultan just what a Venetian artist was capable of doing. And Gentile Bellini obliged, and while in Istanbul, made many sketches. He painted the portrait of the Sultan, Mohammed II, the conqueror, who, according to Vasari, was so impressed by Gentile Bellini's portrait of him that he said, "C'è qualche spirito qui dietro." There must be some spirit behind it, which actually, knowing Islamic philosophy, he could actually have said, because such things were said for Muslim artists. Gentile Bellini left behind in Istanbul this wonderful sketch of a Turkish artist on the left, which didn't come back to the West until the 20th century, and which spawned very interesting imitations in the Islamic world that we'll see in our conclusion. But let's come back to Venice with Gentile Bellini, who, thanks to his Turkish sketchbook, is going to put little Turkish characters all over his Venetian scenes. This is a detail of the procession of 1496 in St. Mark's Square, and I invite you to look even closer. You see these three little Turkish witnesses to the procession of the True Cross, and Albrecht Dürer, the German Renaissance artist, visiting Venice and Gentile Bellini's studio in 1495, actually copied them. And Dürer and other Germans are going to introduce these Venetian sketches of Muslims into German art, where they will serve to show the nasty pagans as contemporary Muslims persecuting the Christians, as here the martyrdom of Saint Sebastian. So on the left, you see another one of these Turkish sketches by Gentile Bellini, a kneeling janissary or officer of the imperial guard in Turkey, and reappearing here in Dürer's martyrdom of Saint Sebastian. Even clearer is, but unfortunately I couldn't get a color reproduction, I couldn't get a color reproduction of this fresco by Pinturicchio, done in 1492 in the Vatican, but where the Roman officer ordering the martyrdom of Saint Sebastian is actually an adaptation of Gentile Bellini's Turkish officer. So Gentile Bellini's sketchbook is used, but I have to bring in another current to crack the mystery of what will be Giorgione's three philosophers. This is the reception in Italy of Islamic philosophy. By the accidents of history, we know that one of the greatest hearths, creative centers of Islamic philosophy in all the world was Spanish Cordova. And one of the greatest Islamic philosophers who ever lived, died in 1198, was the Cordovan philosopher Ibn Rushd, translated into Hebrew by Spanish Jews and into Latin, where he was given the name Averroes. European Christians were so impressed with Averroes' philosophy that King Frederick II of Sicily in the early 13th century invited a Briton, Michael Scott, who had spent 20 years in Toledo in Spain, learning Arabic and translating Averroes, to come to Palermo, very Muslim-looking town, as you can see from the church of San Giovanni degli Eremitani on the right. Frederick II invited Michael Scott to come to Palermo to finish his translations of the philosophy of Averroes and Averroes' precious commentaries upon Aristotle, to finish them in Latin form, and then Frederick II, as of 1220, sent these translations by Michael Scott to the great universities in Italy and also in Northern Europe. So after 1220, Averroes, in Latin form, is taught in Bologna, is taught in Paris, is taught in Oxford. And for most of Christian Europe, the thought of Averroes in its Latin guise becomes the main idea of Islamic philosophy that is available to medieval Christian Europeans. Now, the very earliest depiction we have of Averroes, Ibn Rushd, you can actually see the Latin on the upper left there, Averroes, is in this drawing by a scholar of the University of Padova in the early 14th century. And this already becomes a type, whereby the Muslim philosopher on the left, Averroes, has to be made as recognizably Muslim as possible. So an early 14th century Italian gives him a long beard, long hair coming from under a turban, but he's the Muslim. But he is the commentator, as Dante calls Averroes, il gran commento feo, he who wrote the great commentary. And he will be shown almost systematically in conversation with an ancient Greek. Here, the Neoplatonic philosopher Porphyrius, dressed as a contemporary early 14th century Western Christian scholar, and the idea is that these two men are engaged in a constant dialogue. And Western Christendom accepts the idea that no commentator better understood the meaning of Aristotle than Averroes. This does not mean that you adhere to Averroes' philosophy. What it does mean is that you sharpen your wits through the study of Averroes in order finally to affirm the triumph of the Christian spirit. And if I had to compare the impact of Averroes on Western European thought from the 13th century on, I would then compare it to that of, say, Trotsky on 20th century political thought. That is, Trotsky, in places like Western Europe, North America, or even in the Soviet Union, dangerous, subversive, very intelligent, and to prove the superiority of your brand of Marxism, if you happen to be a Stalinist, or your capitalism, if you happen to be a capitalist, you have to be able to overcome Trotsky in argument, because Trotsky is recognized as the most brilliant, or one of the most brilliant, of these minds that you fear as carrying an ideological system, that if you cannot refute it point by point intellectually, you may be defeated by it. Brute force, fine. War, fine. But you also have to be able to retort with the mind. And this is very much what the philosopher Averroes systematically taught in European universities from the 13th to the 16th century becomes. The symbol of the Islamic mind, of the Islamic intelligence, seductive, and it makes you afraid. And you turn to the church to provide counter-arguments to show that you have absorbed the system of Averroes, but you have overcome it in the light of higher Christian knowledge. And Averroes stands as the central champion of everything you want to overcome. This is why Averroes becomes so central in these representations. Admired and feared at the same time. Feared precisely because he is admired, and admired because he is feared. So when St. Thomas Aquinas, in this painting that we now know as by Lippo Memmi from the early 14th century, when St. Thomas Aquinas is shown in triumph in a church in Pisa, St. Thomas Aquinas, who in the later 13th century, as a member of the Dominican order, wrote so many treatises against Averroes, contra Averroistas, against the believers in Averroes. Nevertheless, St. Thomas cannot do without Averroes. He argues with Averroes, so that he is represented with Plato on the right and Aristotle on the left, and the fathers and the apostles above him, sending rays of wisdom unto the book that he holds upon his lap. Below, the secular and the priesthood. Look up at St. Thomas Aquinas, doctor of the church with veneration, except for one person, and that is the Muslim philosopher, Averroes himself, shown turning his head away from Thomas Aquinas and the truth he preaches turning his head away, and Averroes' great book of commentary is shown flat down, upside down. Averroes is eternally vanquished by Thomas. Just as in medieval Christian churches, you will often see the depiction, the sculpture of the church triumphant as a young woman with a spear and a crown looking at a figure of Christ. And then on the other side of the doorway, you will see another young woman with her eyes bandaged, turning away from the Christ. A crown slips from her head, and she leans on a broken reed. She represents the synagogue as opposed to the church triumphant, with the idea that every time a medieval Christian entered a church, he watched the eternally repeated triumph of the church over the synagogue. When a Christian priest, and from the late 13th, early 14th century on, every ambitious priest who wanted to be anything more than a parish priest, who wanted to accede to the higher orders of the church, had to read Averroes. He had to read Averroes because St. Thomas Aquinas argued with Averroes. And in order to understand St. Thomas Aquinas, you had to absorb what St. Thomas Aquinas knew about Averroes. So every Christian priest was therefore invited by St. Thomas Aquinas to participate in this intellectual debate where, again, the truth of the church would be established by overcoming Averroes in eternal argument. And again, I think we can draw a 20th century parallel where George Orwell was obviously thinking about Trotsky in 1984 when the mythical character of Immanuel Goldstein, the subversive intellectual, is projected onto the screens of Big Brother's propaganda so that Big Brother can eternally vanquish Immanuel Goldstein with the superior argument of Big Brother's ruling party. And the idea is this is a combat which lasts as long as the world will last. So Averroes, like the devil, will always be with us, or like the very harsh medieval Christian view of Judaism, it will last until Judgment Day and the millennium. Then it will be allowed to disappear. But until then, the church reaffirms its triumph. It affirms its triumph over the synagogue, depicted as a woman with bandaged eyes, and it affirms the triumph over Islam, depicted as the great and terrible philosopher Averroes. As Thomas quotes from the Psalms, or Proverbs rather, veritatem meditabitur gutur meum et labia mea detestabuntur impium. My throat shall meditate the truth, and my lips shall detest the impious one. That is Averroes, at the very center of the book that St. Thomas Aquinas holds against his chest. In this painting in 14th century Florence by Andrea Bonaiuto in the Spanish chapel of Santa Maria Novella, again you see the triumph of St. Thomas Aquinas, surrounded by the luminaries of the church and the Old Testament. You can even recognize Moses here with his ray-like horns. And St. Thomas now triumphs like the devil in Dante's hell over a counter-trinity, the trinity of the evil, the trinity of the damned. Sabellius the heretic, Arius the heretic, and the worst heretic of all, the one in the center, Judas in Dante's system, Averroes in Thomas Aquinas' system. And you can see Averroes here up close, made very recognizable as the great Muslim philosopher. And definitely here at the feet of St. Thomas Aquinas, we're not talking about the three wise men. It's a counter-triad. Now, in the 15th century, we know that with the invention of printing, Venice, from 1469 on, established itself as one of the greatest printing centers in the world. One of the miracles of scholarship is that most of the Muslim philosophers known to medieval Europeans who had been translated into Latin between the late 12th and the early 14th centuries were first printed in Venice, centuries before they were even printed in the Muslim world itself. And the Venetians, among the very first books which they printed for the curriculum of the Venetian University at Padua, printed, of course, the works of Aristotle, regarded as the foundation of scientific learning, but the text of Aristotle here would always be accompanied in smaller print by the commentaries of Averroes, as you can see written there, Aristotelis Stagirite, and then below, cum Averroes Cordobensis commentarii, with the commentaries of Averroes of Cordova. And while we know that the Jews in Spain suffered tremendous persecution in the 15th century, Venice gave them a relative welcome. Venice became a center of Jewish scholarship by the end of the 15th century, and we know that eminent rabbis in Venice, with their knowledge of the Spanish Hebrew versions of Averroes, actually served as editorial advisors for the Venetian printing press for up-to-date, proper editions of the works of Aristotle with the comments of Averroes. Much of Averroes' work in the original Arabic has actually been lost, and we know a lot of it as preserved by Venice in Latin or even in Hebrew versions. Here again is one of the very first printed editions of Aristotle with the Averroan commentary. This was printed for the University of Padua by the Venetians in 1483, and the owner of this early printed edition wanted to make it look like a manuscript, personalize it, so he had the artist Girolamo of Cremona paint what looks like miniatures in a manuscript. They are hand-painted, and what's interesting about this page of Aristotelian text and Averroan commentator is that Girolamo da Cremona actually shows us in 1483 the intellectual curriculum that was required reading in a great European university. What you have there at the top on this sort of balcony is what 15th century Italians called the turba philosophorum, the crowd of philosophers. The column in the middle stands for the separation of time. On the right, the ancients. On the left, those that 15th century Europeans considered the moderns. So on the right, you have the Greeks, dressed the way Venetians thought they should have dressed, that is like contemporary Byzantine Greeks, with a kind of bowler hat and beards. Here, right next to the column, raising a finger, pointing to the heavens, is Aristotle. Aristotle looks back at his own master, Plato. Behind Plato and Aristotle stand the two Greek commentators that were familiar not only to Renaissance Italians, but also to the Muslims, Themistius and Alexander of Aphrodisias. And to the far right, you have the caricature of those human beings who do not read or understand philosophy. They may look like human beings, but they are actually apes, which are caricatures of human beings, turning their backs on wisdom and wearing the hood of a buffoon. So this is a very important look there, turning the back away. And to the left of the column, you have the moderns. That is closest to Aristotle because we may hate him, but we recognize that he understood him best, is Averroes, the all-purpose Muslim philosopher. Right behind Averroes is the other Muslim philosopher who is very much read in Latin by the European Middle Ages, so much so that St. Thomas Aquinas actually quotes him sometimes in rebuttal of some arguments of Averroes. This is the early 11th century metaphysician, mystic, philosopher, and physician, known in Latin form as Avicenna, or the way the Italians would have pronounced it, Avicenna. That is a Latin transcription of the Arabic Ibn Sina, son of Sina. Ibn Sina, Central Asian Persian, was very much read in medieval Islamic Spain and was part of the group of philosophers translated from the Arabic into Latin at the orders of the church in Toledo in the 12th century. But because of an error of translation, one of the church translators, Gerardus Cremonensis, in the 12th century, mistranslated his title in Arabic, which was a Sheikh al-Rais, the supreme sheikh, supreme sheikh, as the Latin senes rex, that is, the elder king, encouraging Western Europeans to think that Avicenna, like Ptolemy, had not only been a philosopher and a doctor, but also a king. Therefore, he will be shown with a crown over his turban, or the turban is wrapped around a crown, and because he was also a physician whose book of medicine was studied as the standard textbook in medicine in European universities until the 17th century, the canon of medicine, he is therefore shown not in the kind of jalabiya-type tunic of an ordinary Muslim, he is shown wearing the gown of an Italian doctor of medicine. So we can distinguish these two Muslims, who are the two Muslims that Dante recognizes, along with Saladin, as the three wise Muslims who are allowed a place not in hell proper, but in limbo. And behind the two Muslims, benefiting from the two Muslims, in his own interpretations of the ancient Greeks, is the champion of the Catholic Church, Saint Thomas Aquinas, in his Dominican habit on the far left. So that the artist Girolamo da Cremona has depicted the entire adventure of philosophy and human thought as perceived by Renaissance Europeans before the close of the 15th century. And you see how much in the very center the pair created by Averroes and Aristotle stand out as protagonists. Even a St. Thomas Aquinas cannot do without them, and therefore the message is, neither can we. We can leaf through this wonderful book, which is preserved in the Pierpont Morgan Library. In every case, the artist depicts an Italian doctor, like Pietro d'Abano here, in eternal symbolic disputation with Averroes below, who, as it were, upholds the whole philosophical system, and who is made to appear here as if he were the symbol of human reason going as far as it can without being illuminated by divine grace, so that ingenio transcendimus ad astras, through our genius we can ascend to the stars. Wonderful depiction of Averroes, the upholder of the system, even though we oppose him. But no one in late medieval Europe opposed Averroes more bitterly than the Italian humanist than we can call the inventor of modern Western civilization. That's a tall order. What do we mean? Petrarch, Francesco Petrarca, poet, humanist, who in 1367, residing in Venice, bitterly attacked the teaching of the Arab philosophers and doctors in European universities. It was Petrarch, in a pamphlet issued as a blast against the Averroist scholars of Venice, said, "I detest the entire Arab race. We are Christians. Our foundations must be the Greeks and the Romans. I do not accept Arabic thought, philosophy, medicine. They must be expelled." He wrote a whole pamphlet in 1367. Here's Petrarch represented by Andrea del Castagno in the 15th century. Petrarch wrote a pamphlet called Of My Ignorance, but also that of many others, in which he demanded the expulsion of the Latinized Arabic authors from the European curriculum. And what we're going to see in the 15th and 16th centuries is going to be the struggle between the university authorities who are trying to maintain the study of the Arabic authors and the humanists, so-called in the Petrarchan spirit, who are going to demand the final expulsion of Averroes and all other Arabs from the curriculum. So, despite Petrarch's blasts, in the 15th century, Venice and its university Padua are still great centers of Averroean learning, so that Averroes, again, is seen as upholding this whole philosophical system. And here, Girolamo da Cremona shows a wonderful dialogue, the pairing of Averroes and Aristotle. In front of the mountain, linking earth and heaven, as in Dante's system. And here you can actually see that Aristotle, shown as a contemporary Byzantine Greek, sits in front of Plato's cave, this lower world, but Aristotle's finger points to the heavens. There is a world beyond the metaphysics, beyond this lower world. And Averroes may not see all the way up to where Aristotle is pointing towards what will be the Christian truth, but nevertheless, Averroes is so close to Aristotle that we cannot expect to understand Aristotle if we do not read Averroes. And they are shown as a pair. Now look at this. I would argue, and this is the theory that I defended in Venice, that what Giorgione depicts here in The Three Philosophers of 1504 is Averroes with Aristotle, the pair in dialogue, with Aristotle as the old man, ancient times, holding a tablet of astrological signs in reference to Aristotle's own works on the heavens and on metaphysics. Averroes, the middle-aged man, is closest to him. Now, is this simply surmise, analogy? We actually have more and more hints beginning to close in on us. One is this constant depiction of the Muslim philosopher paired with the Greek philosopher in Italian art from the 14th century on. Averroes and Porphyry on the left, on the right, in a late 15th century metal plaque, Aristotle, looking like a Byzantine Greek, teaching, sitting. Before him stands someone who looks like a Muslim commentator. Actually, it's a Greek commentator, Alexander of Aphrodisias, facing Aristotle. But by now, the idea that the commentator of Aristotle is a Muslim, that the artist has actually represented Alexander of Aphrodisias as a Muslim-looking philosopher. They form very much of a conventional pair. Now, this character is very interesting. He's a sketch of a rather arrogant-looking young Turkish merchant by Gentile Bellini, when Gentile Bellini, Giorgione's master, was in Istanbul in 1479, 1480. Now, watch this. Did Giorgione borrow the idea of his standing figure that looks so Muslim from this drawing of an actual living Muslim drawn by his own master, Gentile Bellini? All right, even if he did borrow that figure, does it prove that the standing figure in the turban is a philosopher, indeed Averroes himself? Well, we get further clues. In 1492, another Italian artist, Pinturicchio, master of Raphael, painted in the Vatican apartments in Rome the philosophical disputation of St. Catherine of Alexandria, confuting the pagan philosophers of Egypt before the throne of the pagan emperor. And you can see that Pinturicchio in 1492 has borrowed the Gentile Bellini sketch so that this character indeed becomes a Muslim-looking philosopher. And who is the Muslim-looking philosopher in 15th and 16th century European art? Almost invariably, Averroes. Comparison is very obvious, even to the detail of the finger hooked rather arrogantly, proudly in the sash. We know that Pinturicchio pillaged the notebooks of Gentile Bellini, or copies thereof, peopling his fresco with characters lifted right from the sketchbook, like this Turkish janissary on the left reappears in the fresco. In fact, Pinturicchio was so taken up with this Gentile Bellini standing Turk that he used him for a great fresco in Siena, which he finished in 1507, very close in time to the 1504 Giorgione painting, which certainly depicts symbolically the triumph of Catholicism over Islam, because it shows the Pope, Pius II, who asked the Doge of Venice to organize a crusade by sea in order to recover Constantinople from the Turks, who had just captured it in 1453. And living in Rome at the time, where it was a very strange Turkish character, Bayezid Osman, a Turkish prince, brother to Sultan Mehmed II, who lost his bid for the throne and fled for refuge to the papal court, accepted baptism, became known from the Pope who baptized him as Calixtus Ottomanus, and made a living for the next 30 years dressing in his gorgeous Ottoman robes and proclaiming to every European prince who would listen to him, "If you can set me back up on the throne of Constantinople, which I will take back from my brother, then I, as a Christian, guarantee to you that the whole Ottoman Empire becomes Christian." So this character sort of paraded and made his living that way in these pageants organized in European courts, traveled up to Austria and Burgundy, as the living embodiment of the prediction, of the prophecy, the conversion and submission of Islam's cosmocrator. And here he is, kneeling at the feet of the Pope before this expedition, which actually never sailed in Ancona in 1465. And behind him, you can see that Pinturicchio uses this character to symbolize Islam itself, standing behind the putative sultan, Islam, but Islam about to be vanquished, about to submit at last to the authority of Christ. So I think here the meaning of the painting is that the character in the middle represents Averroes indeed. He is the Muslim philosopher, using a drawing which has come to symbolize Islam itself, but about to be vanquished. Averroes is closest to Aristotle. He looks at Aristotle, but Averroes does not look in the same direction as Aristotle. Aristotle, in this dark wood, is looking towards the future when the light of Christianity will dawn, at the opening of the dark wood of the soul. And the young man here, meditating before the cave, is also calculating the moment when the sun will rise. The whole painting, I believe, is an illustration of Petrarch's pamphlet of 1367, Of My Ignorance and That of Many Others, which was first printed in Venice and made quite a splash in 1501, calling for the expulsion of Averroes from university studies in Venice. And one sentence in particular is of great interest here. We know that the Contarini family who owned this painting was extremely interested in philosophy. We know it so well that we actually have a record of complaints of St. Mark Cathedral Library complaining that the Contarini family were holding on to books and hadn't returned them yet. And we actually have the titles of those books. So it happened in the early 16th century too. So we actually know that these people were very brainy intellectual types. And the sentence, I think, that Contarini asked Giorgione to depict, unless Giorgione knew it himself to begin with, was the Averroists' search for the light of the sun, the way they search for the truth in the works of Aristotle, and yet they turn their backs upon the light of the sun. Now, let's, I think, confirm it by figuring out who the third character is. Now, we have these depictions of the famous opening canto of the Divine Comedy of Dante, where you see some of the same dramaturgy, the idea that the soul emerges from the dark wood and is before the cave, which is the cave to this lower world, but the mountain above the cave rises to the heavens. Dante here turns to look towards his own spiritual mentor, Virgil. It has been suggested by several scholars that the young man of this trilogy, if not young Copernicus, which I think is very, very doubtful, he didn't become famous until another 30 years, and then back in Poland, the idea has been suggested that the young man may represent the Venetian humanist and ferocious opponent of Averroist studies, Ermolao Barbaro, who in the 1480s first translated directly from the Greek, instead of using a Latin version from the Arabic, the Aristotelian commentator Themistius, that Averroes had used, with the argument, why do we have to go to the Arabs now that we can rely directly on our knowledge of the Greek? And Ermolao Barbaro was sent as an ambassador to the papal court by Venice. Then the Venetian Senate was angry with him because he accepted an appointment by the Pope. He died in his 40th year in 1493, and it seems that the Venetian Republic then made amends and asked Carpaccio, who's represented here, to include him in the cycle of St. Ursula as sort of a papal secretary, but dressed as a Venetian senator here. So is this the third character, the young man? Well, perhaps. I think we can make a better case, however, for this. This is an engraving by Martin Schongauer, the German 15th century Alsatian, whose engravings we know were very popular in 15th century Italy. In fact, you can go upstairs and see what the young Michelangelo did with another Schongauer engraving. And I think this engraving is where Giorgione gets the idea for his young man. This inspired young Christian looking up to the hills, or looking up to the heavens, is inspired, I think, by Martin Schongauer's St. John at Patmos. And there is what you can see upstairs, another great Italian Renaissance genius, the young Michelangelo, inspired by, directly, another engraving by Martin Schongauer, Il Bello Martino, Martin the Beautiful, as the Italian Renaissance artists called him. Another theme is Carpaccio's inspiration of St. Augustine, looking up to the heavens to receive inspiration, which I think is what the young Giorgione character is doing. Petrarch certainly approved of Augustine rather than St. Thomas Aquinas, because St. Thomas Aquinas used Arab philosophers and Augustine did not, because he lived well before their time. And this character, too, seems to be an interesting source. This is the illustration to the personal manuscript copy of the poet Virgil that was actually owned by Petrarch, illustrated for him by the great painter Simone Martini in the 14th century, and which shows Virgil as an inspired prophet who foresees the birth of the Christ child in the fourth eclogue, and therefore is Christianized in Italian Renaissance perceptions as a prophet of the Holy Roman Empire, designed by God to unite the world in justice under Emperor Augustus in order to receive the message of Christ. So that Virgil is annexed to the Christian story along with the whole cycle of Troy. In any case, I think we do see a definite connection here of the inspired seer prophet of the Christian triumph here, very much the same position with the outstretched leg, and we see that Giorgione has been using these traditional figures for his own symbolic purposes. And this is why I would suggest, therefore, that our interpretation of the painting is the three ages of man. Fabio Biondi, the Italian humanist of the 15th century, actually invented the concept that there was ancient times, there are modern times, and between the ancient times of the Greeks and Romans and our modern times stand the Middle Ages. That is actually a concept which Fabio Biondi suggested as an analogy to the three ages of man. And here Aristotle stands for ancient times. The young man on the left, maybe Ermolao Barbaro, or whoever this young inspired Christian is, stands for young modern times, and in the Middle Ages, represented by the Muslim philosopher. The Muslim philosopher who, as Petrarch says, may be great in his understanding of Aristotle. Certainly Giorgione still considers him central to our intellectual tradition, but he turns his back upon the light of the sun. Even though, like Aristotle, he will never emerge from the dark wood of the soul, yet Aristotle looks in the correct direction. Like the young man of our Christian times, beyond the dark night of the forest and beyond the darkness of the material world of the cave in which Christ chose to be incarnated, the youngest age of man can look upon the triumph of Christ. Just 3 years, 3 only, after Giorgione finished his 3 philosophers, Raphael in the Vatican in 1507 painted the famous School of Athens, in which we can already see the triumph of Petrarch. That is the modern definition of Western civilization. In Giorgione, in 1504, the Arab philosopher of Cordova was still central. By 1507, the great philosophers are all Greeks and Latins. In the middle, you have Plato, who seems to be a portrait of Leonardo da Vinci, and Aristotle. And where is the Muslim in all this? There's actually a pamphlet in the British Museum series monographs on great paintings of the Western world. And the question raised in this monograph written in 1997 is, one wonders what the exotic foreigner is doing among all these noble Greeks and Romans. And the exotic foreigner is Averroes, now shifted to the side, an eavesdropper over the shoulder of Pythagoras, a Greek philosopher, and this has become the perception of Islamic culture in the West. Averroes was a European. Averroes was a Spaniard. Averroes' legacy lingered far more among Christian and Jewish Europeans than in the Islamic world itself. He is a participant in the great intellectual debate of 300 to 400 years of European history. And yet, no one reads Averroes today except specialists. That is pretty much what has been the fate of Islamic culture in the redefinition of European culture. That is, it is exotic, it's not central to the canon. If you study it, you're a specialist, you're interesting, you're exotic, you bring a breath of fresh air, but you're not central. A European scholar, until the end of the 15th century, to master the teachings of the church, had to master Thomas Aquinas. To master Thomas Aquinas, he had to master Averroes. Therefore, Averroes and the Arabic culture of Averroes was central to the European canon itself. With the triumph of Petrarch's ideas, we get the School of Athens of 1507, where Islamic culture becomes a sideline. So I think on this note, we can say farewell to the noble Moor of Venice. Thank you very much.